Two poor men swapped the grain in their bags. One of them carried the bag and broke through the fence, quickly returning home. He had traded half a bag of ash for half a bag of walnuts. His wife brought a large basin and asked him to pour it into store and eat slowly. One of the children eagerly cracked open the walnuts, only to find they were acorns. The man in the green clothes was so angry he almost fainted. He never expected his good friend to deceive him too. He stormed out, grabbing a wooden plank and heading to his friend's house. The other man, dressed in white, had also returned home. He told his children that he had traded half a bag of acorns for half a bag of rice. The children rushed to grab spoons, and his wife asked him to pour the rice into the wooden basin to cook porridge, but when he poured it out, it was all ash. The family stared at each other in disbelief. The man in white angrily ran outside, never expecting his good friend to deceive him as well. He grabbed a tree branch by the side of the road, preparing to confront him. The two friends met again at the place where they had made the trade, each carrying something to try and intimidate the other. Suddenly, a pot fell to the ground, and the man in green couldn't help but laugh. It seemed neither of them could deceive the other. They then decided to find work together. Soon, a wealthy landlord hired both of them. Though the job only lasted 3 days, the landlord gave them each a tray of gold. However, both men were not just poor, but also greedy. The man in white said that during the days they worked, the landlord's deep pit of gold had been left unguarded. The two men had the same idea. That night, they secretly sneaked into the backyard, to the pit where the gold was buried. They tied their two belts together, lowering one man to collect the gold. The man on the ground, seeing the sack full of gold, said, "Pull the sack up first, then pull me up." The man in the pit, fearing that his friend might take the gold for himself, stuffed himself into the sack and asked him to pull him up as well. Sure enough, he knew his good friend well. The man in white carried the gold home without looking back, until he reached the safety of the forest. Only then did the man in green climb out of the sack and scold him. Then he suggested they sleep for the night and leave in the morning. The friend thought he had been forgiven, but in fact, the man in green was waiting for him to fall asleep so he could steal the gold and keep it for himself. The next morning, the man in white took a branch and made a whip, then pulled a thread from his pants to use as a lash. He began to imitate the sound of a cow. The man in green, far off, thought a bullock cart was coming, and since he had walked such a long way, he thought he could catch a ride. But instead, it was his good friend. The man in white said, "We can't deceive each other, so let's sleep for now and split the gold in the morning." The friend, seeing his sincerity, began to rest. When he fell sound asleep, his good friend placed a stone under him, then grabbed the sack of gold and ran home. He pushed open the door, panting, and called his wife, asking her to put the gold in the chest and cover it with a shovel, burying it in the graveyard so others would think he was gone. To prevent him from suffocating in the dirt, his wife placed a thin layer of soil over him, then went back home, lighting 2 candles, and wept loudly at the table. Meanwhile, the man in green had woken up, and upon seeing the stone, immediately ran to his friend's house. After learning what happened, he felt that his death was too sudden, and suspected something wasn't quite right. The man in green pretended to be deeply distressed, asking the wife for a shovel. He hadn't made it to the funeral, but he could help tidy up the grave. When they arrived at the cemetery, the man in green didn't strike with the shovel. Instead, he started to plow the ground, like an ox. The man in the grave, hearing this, thought the bull was plowing the field, and shouted for it to move away so it wouldn't unearth him. He said, "If you don't, my good friend will find me." But his good friend had already found him. In the end, neither of the two friends could deceive the other, and they had no choice but to return home and split the gold.